Welcome to the Black Humanities Project, the podcast that explores disciplines in humanities and the humans in humanities and how they got there. I'm your host, Rhoda. For this episode, we'll be looking at humanities as disciplines, and today I have Professor Hooper from the Sainsbury Research Unit of University of East Anglia in Norwich, Norfolk.
Centre is the Sainsbury Research Unit, not the centre. We're not a centre.
So, what specialization of humanities are you in?
Under the sort of current classifications of these things, I'm come under a mixed group of humanities that involves art history, anthropology, but of course social anthropology is classified as social sciences. But I don't believe in any of that stuff. This is just artificial classificatory systems that suit the academic industry in Britain or in the West. I do art history, anthropology, museum studies. This is the area that I work in. The reason generally is that I'm interested in human creativity generally, but particularly from the Pacific region.
Can you tell us about your background, whether that's your knowledge and your academic history and how you actually got to entering your role?
Basically, academically at school, I didn't do very well in my A levels. I did them early. I applied to the University of East Anglia to do art history, and I was rejected.
Oh,
So
wow.
I didn't come and study here. I went to study in Yorkshire in Bradford. After I'd studied there, and I got a 2-2 in sociology, literature, and philosophy, I then applied to study teacher training at Brighton Teacher Training College, and I was rejected there, didn't get a place.
Oh, wow.
So I wasn't particularly daunted by these things. Nowadays, I think there's so much pressure on young people. My memories are not that I was then a failure, but one of the reasons why I wasn't so committed perhaps to teaching back then was that I have an unusual history that my grandfather, who worked all his life for the Thames River Authority, test like a conservation officer, you'd call it now, my mother's father. I never knew my own father. He, as a hobby since he was a boy before the First World War, became fascinated by the Pacific region and by art and culture from other parts of the world, especially the Pacific, but also North America and Africa. And this was a hobby. And he read up about these things and he collected things in markets and antique shops through the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s in his spare time as a hobby. But he built up his own private museum because in those days, people didn't value these things from the Pacific or from Africa. They were curios, they'd been brought back by missionaries or colonial officers or travelers or whatever. And Britain was full of them. And, accumulated over 200 years of exchanges in faraway places. And he just as a hobby, I don't know why, I don't know where it came from. Nobody in his family was interested in art or archaeology or anthropology. Children pick up on obsessions, and he was obsessed. So he acquired all these things with his pocket money whilst he was working. Probably didn't do a lot of work. I suspect he was skiving off work a lot of the time to go to local antique shops, But he then retired when he was 60, and he opened his own private museum in the south of England for sixpence for people to go in and look at his private museum of things from all over the world. I remember as a boy sitting at the desk and taking the sixpences. So I grew up with him. And to me, I then began to develop this fascination as well with faraway places. So this is not an academic background, really. I didn't sort of choose to do anthropology. I basically grew up in this strange museum environment, surrounded by things from far away, which I found fascinating. And my grandfather, he never traveled to any of these places. He was just fine. You could find all these things in antique shops and junk shops and local auctions or small museums closing down. He saw it as sort of salvage. He was rescuing these things from, literally on some occasions, from bonfires. People were saying, oh, we don't want all this old, rubbish from Africa, burn it. One museum was doing that. He saw the remains of a bonfire, terrible. But this was back in the 1930s and 40s. He got terminal lung cancer when I was at university, and I sat with him for 4 months and helped him catalogue his entire collection, which made me completely obsessed with the detailed knowledge he had of all these things about clubs from Fiji and clubs from Tonga and clubs from New Zealand and things like this, fish hooks from here and there, different styles, North American things, African things. And I learned an enormous amount from him, because people who are obsessed with a hobby are often extremely knowledgeable. He never went to university, he never studied, but he had very good books. And his head, from what he was reading, was in the 18th and the 19th century, really, in these places. And so I learned at his knee as he was literally dying, and when I was 20. And as a result of that, I then ended up being really interested in this. And to cut a very long story short, I managed to get a job at the British Museum for a year when they were doing a cataloguing project. And my job was to open boxes and identify what was in there and link it up to the documentation. Brilliant job in 1972. Then I managed to publish a catalogue of my grandfather's collection, an illustrated book, which was great. Although his collection is now dispersed. The family had no money, we couldn't keep it. But many of the things are now in Tahiti Museum or Fiji Museum or, museum in Hawaii or wherever I go in North America or Canada. Things from his collection now in those museums, which is great for me to see old friends. But as a result of that, I thought, my grandfather never went to these places. I want to go to the Pacific where people are still making these things. I'm fascinated. Yeah. And so I thought I chose anthropology as the best route to go to study literally another culture and try and immerse myself in another cultural situation amongst people who were making things, who knew how to make things with their hands, who were creative. I did a transfer course, a one-year course in social anthropology at Cambridge, and then I did a PhD at Cambridge in social anthropology. But I only did it as a way of getting to the Pacific. So it was a ruse, really.
Yeah.
I was never interested in a PhD as such, but I wanted to go to the Pacific not just as a traveler, but for a real reason to try to understand things more deeply and to spend quality time there. And in those days, you went off to do your research. There was no email. You didn't communicate with a supervisor. Basically, I went to Fiji and I didn't come back for 2 years.
Yeah.
Which is what I wanted to do, really. And in Fiji, I learned an enormous amount, not only about Fijian culture, but about leadership and all sorts of how to be a human being. I would say I've learned much more by immersing myself in another culture and learning another language and different ways of being than I would in classes. But the next best thing, given that it was a tremendous privilege for me to go away and live in another culture, in a remote island, no electricity, no roads, nothing like that, where people were incredibly resilient and got on with their lives from birth to death. They dealt with it. There was no hospital, there was no social services, nothing like that. If they wanted a house, they had to build it. If they wanted a transport, they had to build a canoe. If they wanted food, they had to grow their gardens. So very, very self-reliant, brilliant. But of course, classified under World Bank terms as impoverished. But of course, they were not impoverished at all, because they could supply their needs in a very handsome way. But anyway, but not get me on the idea of what World Bank and all these things classify people as, and that sort of colossal, in a way, much more of a colonialist industry than the old colonialism in a way. But I think I just want to explain that because I fell into anthropology because of my grandfather. And when I went to Fiji and I tried to explain to people, I said, well, it's very nice you're here. Why are you here? And when I said, well, my grandfather inspired me to be interested in these things, and they're still made in Fiji, people still made canoes, beautiful textiles, bark cloth, carved bowls. Fijians understood immediately, your grandfather, this is part of your line, this is in your ancestry. Yeah. Your ancestor has inspired you to do this. You don't need any more explanation. We understand now about that. It's respect for your ancestor, your grandfather, and you're following on his interests. So that's really, so I was received very well in Fiji and indeed New Zealand and other places I visited. Just to help you with the sort of disciplinary background, humanities, in a way I perhaps trained in the humanities, not in the sciences or indeed the social sciences, through being interested about other people and their other cultural arrangements without judging them. Well, I am judging them because I think they're fantastic, but, judging them in that way, and how when I came back to England, how inadequate I thought many of the ways that we do things are or were.
So you would say it was more so field work and like your circumstances in studying? Like you use studying as a catapult to get you to the places to actually do the work that you wanted to.
Yes, I think it's right. I mean, you could say I used anthropology, but some people, when they're a teenager, want to do anthropology or archaeology, and that's fine. They
Yeah.
know something about it, and they think that's really interesting. I'm motivated by that. That wasn't the same with me. It was through objects. It was through familiarity with what people have made all over the world, and being able to handle them and look at them close up. In my grandfather's house, which you can't really do in a museum, there's always normally a display case, glass in between you and something. So I was really, really lucky to have that, my mother's father, have that obsession. My grandmother didn't agree with it and she felt neglected, but that's how it was. There's always a price to pay, perhaps, but he certainly inspired me. And then I thought, well, within the academic world here, if I do anthropology, it's a way of getting to the Pacific as a bona fide visitor, someone to stay there a long time, completing a project. But then I never intended to be an academic. After that, I had no idea what I was going to do. And my idea when I finished my PhD was that I would go back to Fiji and maybe teach or do something in Fiji. But then I had an offer of a job here. I had met the Sainsburys by then. They had given their collection to the University of East Anglia. Bob Sainsbury had promised the University of East Anglia he would do a comprehensive catalogue of the Sainsbury collection to give to the university, as well as the collection that had already been given. So in 1982, he and Lady Sainsbury, Eliza, asked me, because Bob said, I cannot possibly edit a catalogue or do a catalogue. He was already in his 70s. And he asked me if I would do it because I knew how to do it. And would I? So basically, I was employed to edit the catalogue of the Sainsbury collection, which took many years, published in 1997, 3 volumes. Soon after that, they had the idea that because the collection is here at UEA with many things from Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, as well as European art and Asian art, that there was nowhere that students could study Africa, Oceania, and the Americas art and art history and archaeology in this country in a dedicated way. There are different, you can do, there are particular lecturers here and there who specialize, but no dedicated department that would do teaching programs, masters, PhDs, etc. in this field. And so they proposed that they would start a department, and I was already here at UEA working on the catalogue. So I ended up starting this department in 1988. We took the first students in. And I agreed that I never wanted to be a lecturer. I wouldn't have applied for a lecturer's job. But this job was, in a sense, they said, look, just, you know about these things, teach them, do what you want, write your own job description. Pretty amazing thing, isn't it, really? I remember I spoke to my supervisor in Cambridge, my PhD supervisor, very nice guy. And I explained to him, I don't know, I've been offered this, but I want to go back to Fiji. And he looked at me sort of blankly, said, but you can write your own job description. They give you money to do your programs. You've got things to do you like doing. He said, it's what people's dreams are made of. Why wouldn't you do it? And so in a way, he was right, because I agreed to do it for 5 years. But after 5 years, it was going quite well. I was enjoying it. And I thought it's hard to find a better job. And so I'm still here.
Yeah, because you don't have the freedom of traveling and extending your fieldwork anymore. I get what you mean.
No, well, when I first started working for the Sainsbury's, I said, look, can you only employ me for 9 months so I can go for 3 months of the year back to Fiji or to the Pacific? But after a while, I didn't do that because I was so busy. But what I've managed to do in my job here is do research projects that have involved me going to the Pacific, and I've kept my relationship up with Fiji and Fiji Museum, and we've done Fiji projects. Well, this, in terms of one of the more memorable things I've been involved in, was an AHRC-sponsored Fiji project that we did in collaboration with Fiji Museum. And it was personal to me because a lot of my grandfather's Fijian objects are now in Fiji Museum. We donated a lot to Fiji Museum. With Fiji Museum and with other museums in the UK, we did a documentation historical project on Fijian art and Fijian collections, which was really successful. A big exhibition came out of it, a book. But one of the things that was most memorable is that canoe building, sailing canoe building, was dying out in Fiji. Only a few specialists knew how to make them. And so I managed, as part of this project, to get some sponsorship for the best canoe builder in Fiji to build a beautiful double-hulled canoe in the traditional way. Domo did this, and that canoe was built. We sailed it in Fiji. It was a proper sailing double-hulled canoe, beautiful, all no metal in it, all made with wood and coconut husk fiber tied together with string, basically. Really beautiful canoe. Then it came over here for the exhibition. It appeared at the Queen's 90th birthday pageant, in which Fiji featured, and it's now permanently installed in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich as a feature of their maritime, one of their maritime galleries. So that initiative has spawned 2 more canoes were built, really encouraging younger people to get involved in canoe building. And of course, nowadays it's carbon-free transport, revaluing sailing canoe technology and not going down the outboard engine route all the time, where fuel is expensive. So basically another canoe has been built and it's now in the big museum in Berlin. They paid for it. And another one is in California. To me, I liked sailing. When I was in Fiji, I went sailing canoes around the islands, with the locals. So that's something I'm quite proud of, and has been a lot of fun, that people have been refining and, in a sense, generating or recapturing pride in doing these things, rather than being pressed all the time to go down the modern route of outboard engines and carbon-intensive travel.
It seems like your connection sort of allowed you to connect Fijians with like the people in Norwich, which is really nice. To like bring
Yes,
into, which
yes.
is
Yeah, we had, I mean, there's a big diaspora Fijian population in the UK, grouped in various areas, Stoke and Rochdale and northwest of England, different parts of the country, often linked to 2 things. One is rugby. People came over from the 1960s, very good rugby players, Fijians, and came over, played rugby and then settled, but mainly through the British Army over many, many years. British Army have recruited Fijians, and they've come often with their wives and had children here. So there are 10,000 Fijians or more over here, and of course quite a few of them came to the exhibition we had in Norwich, and we've worked closely with the Fiji High Commission. So for me, yeah, I mean, there are bits of Fiji in the UK, which is very nice to engage with and keep those connections going.
Yeah. You sort of mentioned that you took a untraditional route to get into where you are. So what would you recommend like someone now who wanted to sort of get into lecturing in art history or anthropology, but maybe sort of wants to also maybe following your footsteps, like what is the best way to like actually get started with that?
Yes, I mean, I think obviously we're in a system in this country, an educational system which we can't really change, and
Yeah.
things are classified: anthropology, art history, archaeology, humanities, social sciences. Those structures are sometimes restricting, but they can be a little permeable. Anyone at school, let's say, who is interested in any humanities subject, whether it's European literature or Fijian art, to me the most important thing is that your heart should be in it. I was interviewing prospective MA students just earlier in the week. I asked a student, why do you want to come and study in our department? What is it that motivates you for this? And the student was saying, oh, well, you have very good facilities and this, that, and the other, and you've got some good alumni. And I said, yeah, well, that may be true. But I said, what's in your heart? Why do you want to do this? We want people to come here who really want to do it, not just to tick off a master's or a PhD. And so my advice to any young, and I've got 2 sons who are obviously grown up now, but is that if something is in your heart in that direction, then pursue it and you'll find a way, whether it's through anthropology or literature or archaeology or whatever it might be. If you find something fascinating and you can study it and maybe make a career out of it, you are amongst the blessed.
Yeah.
Because academic salaries, there are people, academics, who could be lawyers or doctors or whatever and earn twice the money. But would they feel as fulfilled if they didn't really want to be an accountant or want to be a lawyer or want to be a doctor, if they wanted to study literature or dig, archaeological sites somewhere? Is that what would, in a sense, allow them to look back on their lives and think, I did something and I managed to make a living out of something I really, really enjoyed. And to be able to do that is a tremendous privilege. And so I would encourage people to try and identify what is it that really motivates you, and then pursue that and find a way through. And also the fact, I got rejected by my university, I got rejected by teacher training college. I mean, it's ironic now I'm a professor,
Yeah.
but also don't be daunted. Don't be daunted. People might think, oh, well, I've come from a privileged background or whatever, but, we all get slapped back, or people are mean to us or bully us. I know anthropologists who are bullies, and the department in Cambridge was pretty horrible. There were some very nice people, and there were bullies and people trying to climb the greasy pole of academic life. One gets setbacks or discouragements, but try and keep your eye on the prize and not be deflected, and then you have a much better chance of achieving something that you find is fulfilling.
I wanted to ask you, what excites you most about the future of humanities, especially considering like technology advancing, and also like the effect that technology has on like archiving materials is something that I'm also fascinated.
The future is exciting. Obviously, I'm teaching, young students. Someone doesn't want to be depressed about the future, so oh, it's all going wrong. Technology is a mess, or social media. Actually, the opposite. I mean, the world is full of opportunities, it seems to me. And one of the reasons why is because human beings are remarkably creative. And what human beings have created over 10,000 years, and especially in the last few hundred years, these things are of real value and shouldn't be discarded in relation to new things. So I think that a career in the humanities, where it can be, about the past, often history or whatever subjects like that, about understanding more profoundly human creativity, human cultures around the world, being human. But of course, new technologies are human creations. But I think there's a danger that one has a delusion that they somehow solve problems as much as create them. So, for instance, digital records of photographs. If something crazy went, and suddenly the cloud evaporated,
Yeah.
a lot of people would be stranded because they don't have hard copy versions of all sorts of things. Now, we can't fill the world up with paper copies of everything, but I think there are always comparative judgments to be made that there's an exciting future out there in subjects to do with the humanities, in actually touching things and dealing with things that people have made and people are creating, but to be a little bit careful of pitching everything into new technologies and digitization and things before. I mean, they're so new, we don't really know whether these things have a 50-year lifespan or not. I'm not against, I'm not a Luddite, but I think one has to be a little bit cautious and value things that you can actually touch, and be a little bit cautious about things that you can't. It's a rather facile answer, but I think there are a lot of exciting things, and also human problems are not solved by technology, they're solved by wisdom. And wisdom comes from intercultural understandings, it seems to me.
Yeah. How would you describe like your like typical day-to-day roles like now? Like obviously you've listed that your role has sort of evolved over time, but how would you describe your current role?
So in my job, let's say during term time, I'll be co-teaching an MA course here. There might be, a lecture to be delivered, tutorial supervisions with students, whether they're master's students or PhD students, reading student work, commenting on it. In a typical day, there might be one or two of these, a bit of teaching, supervision. Then there might be thinking about planning a research project, or reading a draft of somebody else's research project in the department that they're wanting to submit for funding within our range of things. So I'll have, I suppose you might call it a mentoring role to colleagues. I might be thinking about my own research work and dealing with students. We'll have visiting fellows. We might be spending time with them. For me personally, and then there's administration of the department. I sort of run, there are 6 of us faculty, there's 10 staff in total, we have our library. So I sort of look after the department as head of the department. That takes up time, general admin. So in the last year or so, I haven't actually had much time for my own research. But then I can try and in the summer, grab some quality time to do something for myself in terms of my own research. But my typical day is just dealing with some admin stuff and a bit of teaching and a bit of, liaising with colleagues. I try to avoid university committees as much as I can, so I don't spend a lot of committee time. So that might be regarded as me being selfish, or I'm just trying to protect my quality time because I don't see my career as a senior manager. I think that's it. But, we have what we do in the department, we have tutorials, one-to-one tutorials, where we don't do a lot of mass teaching. So students who come here get a lot of personal tuition and supervision. And then I'll be sorting out people's risk assessments for going on fieldwork, or, there's a lot of bureaucratic work to be done now in terms of graduate students doing their programs, getting their visas, writing letters in support of overseas students who need to get visas. The whole visa and student situation, as you know, is more and more complex and rather venal in terms of prejudices against genuine overseas students wanting to come and study here, all sorts of hurdles now.
How does that work? Like if they're a student that sort of wants to get into field work in another country, is the uni and you obviously support and guide them. I think with like if they wanted to like start research elsewhere.
We can advise, but again, it's always, does a student really want to do this? And if they really do, then we can support them. Again, I'll be helping students with their maybe research grant applications and things like this periodically. And then if it's a British student who wants to go and do research in New Zealand or something, obviously, if you go overseas, you need to get all the research permissions from the local Minister of Education or any other authorities in that country. So there's all that research permission paperwork to be done to make sure that if you're going to Nigeria, that the Nigerian authorities approve of this piece of research, etc. And then, of course, the British, the university needs risk assessments and absence of leave forms and all that stuff. So there's a lot of sort of relevant bureaucracy. And also because we in our department have a lot of global network now, whether it's in Nigeria or Fiji or wherever it is, we can be in touch with people there saying, we've got a very good student who's really interested in following this up. Can they come and work in your museum collections or whatever it might be, stuff like this. And then that can be arranged, whether it's in the Vatican Museum or the, museums in Canada or Fiji Museum indeed. If it's an overseas student, we have 2 or 3 Nigerian students, a couple of them who are doing archaeology in Nigeria, but they come to do their PhDs here, which is quite interesting because here we have different things we can add to what they can do actually in Nigerian universities. So obviously, but they again, anyone who does archaeology anywhere, even if it's a person living in Norwich who wants to dig outside Norwich, you've got to get your permissions from the landowner and the local authority and all that. These things are all quite properly have to be well managed.
I think my next question would be, are there any like books or other forms of media that you would advise to people wanting to get into your field?
There are introductions to anthropology or introductions to art history. And they're perfectly good books, I think, and perfectly worthy. But I don't know how inspirational they are. If someone says, I'm really into art history, whether it's Dutch painting of the 17th and 18th century, there are obviously books there. I don't have one book that I think, would touch. It depends on where someone wants to work. If it's in early 19th century literature, where there's all sorts of stuff about Jane Austen or whatever, if you want to go into Nigerian literature, of the 20th century, dynamic field. It's difficult for me to name one thing, but I think if you have a real interest in something, it's quite easy to find out through a local library or indeed online. Things that are, and often it's hit and miss. It's also, I'm a believer that people find their way. I think when I was younger, no one said, well, you should read this book, that book, and the other book. I would sort of look at a book, and after a while, I think, well, I'm not sure about this one. I'd move on, and you make your own discoveries, perhaps. So I might recommend that. If you are interested in a field, there are books in whatever field it is, I think. But what I would encourage people to do, whatever the field is, because it's the humanities, try to find something that tells you about the people involved, not some sort of abstract study of something. Because even, Dutch 17th century painting was actually made by particular Dutch people
Yeah.
who were living lives of relative chaos or happiness or misery or whatever, and that somehow the cultural situation, whether it's in Holland or wherever, is giving rise to these particular forms and artistic subject matter, and learning about that, the sort of total picture. Let's look at the total social cultural phenomenon in play here that led to, say, Michelangelo making his sculptures, to do with the relationship with the Catholic Church, the Vatican, and the Pope, and all that sort of thing. Then it becomes a much more intriguing human story, I think. So even reading historical fiction, if someone said, oh, I'm really interested in Tudor history, English Tudor history, you could say, well, read a book about Henry VIII or whatever.
Yeah.
Or you could say, read Wolf Hall. But it was a historical fiction about Cromwell and the king and all that in the 1530s, which is a drama, but it's somehow, it's historically well informed, and so it brings things to life, the real personalities involved. I don't know whether you saw, it was dramatized on TV with Mark Rylance playing the lead character, a brilliant actor. And I remember watching that and thinking, this is fantastic. If I saw this, I'd love to study Tudor history. I would go for the more personal, human aspect of a subject, because it's always there. It's always, people have always done these things and made these things, whether they were rogues or whether they were heroes or whatever. And most people are both. What are you studying? I haven't asked you that.
International development with geography.
Are you happy with that? I mean, are you an MA student or a PhD or?
Undergrad. Yeah,
Undergrad,
I am
right.
really enjoying it because I think I do also have that interest of studying other cultures and development and understanding like people's ideas, and also that sort of idea of like preserving history and preserving cultures that they
Yes.
don't die out in the future is something that really fascinates me, especially in like this modern age where a lot of culture, as culture sort of integrates, we're forming new cultures through
Yeah.
integration.
I mean, nothing ever stands still, but I remember when I was in Fiji back in the 70s and 80s, development was a big thing, and
Yeah.
development is different now than it was then. But then it was like, oh, all these people are impoverished. We classify them as poor. They need to be overloaded with stuff and things and technology, and this is the future. And we in the West or Asia know what these people in the Pacific or Africa need. And it was a thoroughly almost immoral colonialist operation, even though
Yeah.
it was pretending it wasn't colonialist, and it was evangelical in a way, which is a common thread through all of this. And I remember resistance to that in Fiji in some quarters, and certainly in places like Vanuatu, where there's a lot of skepticism about the benefits of development, because development tends to want to generate small nuclear families, individualism, and these things that tend to go against the grain of the more village-focused, clan-focused, community-focused lives of people in the Pacific. Development was sort of driving a wedge between people who previously had always depended on each other and dealt with hurricanes and floods and droughts and all that through quite widespread networks of mutual interdependence. And development was encouraging people, oh, stop giving money away to your cousins. That's a waste of money. You've got to get a job as a bus driver. And it's like, there's not much fun being a bus driver. I'd rather be on my island interacting with my cousins.
Yeah.
And I would have less money, but I would have a more fulfilling life. So development obviously is much more sophisticated now. And I think anthropology and development have had an uneasy relationship, perhaps better now. But when you put in things like geography, and obviously the whole issue now with climate change and environmental issues, it's a very interesting subject area. But it's important, I think, to plug into that the integrity of cultural concerns, and that everything is steamrolled by mechanized development as the solutions. But anyway, so I'm sounding a bit like a polemicist now, lecturing. But I'm just I'm advocating a broader view, I think, of
Yeah, of
what
course.
what makes lives fulfilling for people all around the world. In relation to, I would advocate that the humanities are valuable, about being human. People who study humanities may have a better grasp of how to solve some of our local or indeed international problems. So I would advocate studying humanities not as a waste of time, but as actually a highly productive possibility in which also there are careers and jobs available of all kinds, whether it's journalism or whatever it might be. So that would be one advice, and don't just go into the sciences or whatever because there might be, or accountancy because there might be money there, or a career or
Yeah.
whatever. Basically, I'm saying if you're inclined to that, obviously some people are brilliant at maths and physics and they want to do the sciences, what they want to do. Try as far as is possible to follow your heart and try to manage that, to do something that you find that you want to get up in the morning to do. But also can earn you a living that might not be, millions, but it means that you can exist comfortably to be able to indulge your satisfying interests, whatever they are. It's a little bit anodyne, but I think it's true because I know people who are just working to earn a living and their lives are outside of work. They wait for the evening or knock off at 5, they go off and do their social things, and that's their life, and work is just a sort of necessary chore. And I think that's fine. Most people's lives are like that, I think. But if you have the opportunity that your working life is also really fulfilling, that's a rare privilege. And if you can manage to grasp that in some way, then that's great. It might not bring you the biggest financial rewards, but I think in terms of going to bed at night, feeling okay, that's important.
Thank you today for your time. It's been like
Okay.
really fascinating hearing your history and how you got into the field and how you became a lecturer.
Don't be knocked back by setbacks when you're younger either. I was knocked back a bit, but in a way, I don't have no memories of trauma and being
Yeah.
refused and this, that, and the other. Because I think also when you manage to end up doing something you enjoy doing, it's often through challenging circumstances. But you do it. There will always be people who will say, "Oh, do this, do that, do the other, or don't do this," or might appear to block you this way or that. But I think if you're committed, it's possible to find a way and find the good in people who are able to help you. And if people are not willing to help you, best thing is just to ignore them.
Yeah, 100%.
Anyway, okay, Ruddy. Well, it's been nice to talk to you. And if you want to follow up on any of this or whatever, then I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care then. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.